welcome to another video from the Tiny Menagerie. A fish that sadly sits rather high up on the species you are very likely to walk past in a fish shop is the lovely little Norman's Lampeye Killifish. These delights are often sold as a puny little sliver of grey fish, and even though they already have their striking glowing crescent over their eye from a very young age, they are still very easily looked over compared to bigger and brighter fish. Which is a shame really, considering that they really come into their own once they've matured a bit, where they will develop this lovely golden sheen with highlights of steely blue down their flanks. And they're also absolutely mesmerising to watch if you have the space to keep them en masse. But what are Lampeye killifish like to keep, and what kind of setup do they need? Well, Lampeyes hail from the wetlands and savannahs of Africa, where they have been known to congregate in shoals several thousand strong, especially in slow-moving waters with dense vegetation around the margins. And this being the case, you will want to keep a shoal rather than a single individual, aiming for at least 6 fish and preferably more if you have the space to accommodate them, which you will want to if at all possible, because Lampeyes are marvellous shoalers, sticking at all times in a tight formation that follows each other diligently around the tank. And of course, this is all the more impressive the more fish that you have. And luckily Lampeyes are also a very small species, and so they are easy to accommodate, only growing to around 1.5 inches in length, although it should be noticed that they are extremely active, and so despite that small size, they're really not suitable for nanotanks. They need a tank with a base dimensions of at least 80 centimeters just to make sure they've got enough space to move around. Depth doesn't really matter though, as they are obligate middle ground swimmers, and they will very rarely venture to either the surface or the substrate unless they can see that there is food there. And they're also really quite brave despite that punitive size. Lampeyes certainly benefit from a dimly lit tank, that way that iridescent eye of theirs can really stand out like a cluster of shining blue dots in the darkness. But they don't need much in the way of hiding places, as they rely more on their speed than hiding to keep themselves out of trouble, and so they can be kept in really quite a bare tank. They're also not at all fussy when it comes to water flow, and I found them to be perfectly at home in both still and moderately flowing water, although I wouldn't keep them in a raging torrent. And they can also be kept at the usual range of temperatures for a tropical fish, so anywhere between 20 and 26 degrees is perfect, and they do prefer a fairly neutral pH that hovers around the 7 mark. This makes them a very suitable species for keeping in the community aquarium, especially one specialising in smaller fish, as they are completely harmless to all other fish species. They show no tendency at all to nip fins, even those of the very soft fin species like guppies or bettas. But while keeping as many as possible might be the goal, it is not necessarily that easy, as sadly Lampeyes are not the strongest of fish, and they will succumb quickly to any diseases or injury, or if they're just being kept in poor quality water. In fact, sometimes they seem to die for no apparent reason at all, and now whenever I buy Lampeyes, I will always buy at least 10 or 12 at a time, usually depending on whatever deals a shop has, but invariably I know that that number is going to whittle down over the course of the next 6 months or so, until I will be left with about half of what I started with. And in all honesty, I have no idea why. Once established, the Lampeye are hardy and easy to keep, they feed well, and they usually start breeding once they reach adulthood. But actually getting them to that hardy phase seems to be something of a lottery. And I couldn't tell you what causes it, but definitely it helps to have a very stable and well-established tank before you even consider purchasing some. In fact, I wouldn't add Lampeyes to a tank anything less than a year old, simply because I wouldn't expect many of them to survive. But so long as your tank is thoroughly matured, they are certainly worth a shot. And when it comes to tank mates, Lampeyes get along with the vast majority of other fish. They are fast enough to snatch food away from even the most rambunctious of barbs or danios, but they're not so forceful that they will scare the smaller fish. In fact, the only real danger to a Lampeye is a fish big enough to eat one, and as they have a very slender outline with sleek fins, you will be surprised at just how many fish will try to eat them. Even my aging betta has a go, despite the fact that these days he is too old to catch even a shrimp. And speaking of shrimp, Lampeyes are fairly shrimp safe, as they tend to gather food from the surface of the water rather than hunting for it among plants, and so they tend not to really encounter very many shrimplets. although I would not put it past them to pick off any shrimplet that they caught swimming out in open water. Adult shrimp though, in fact any shrimp larger than 1 centimetre, is perfectly safe from the lampeyes. They won't even try to attack them. And being primarily surface feeders, lampeyes are happy to take flakes or semi-floating foods such as pellets, and they will also happily have a go at bloodworms or frozen foods as well, just so long as they actually see it sink or they can see other fish are feeding. If they don't spot it going down though, I tend to find they will completely ignore it altogether. They certainly aren't picky eaters though, and they will happily consume anything small enough to swallow. Overall, in fact, the Lampeye Killifish should be seen as one of 2 halves. On the one hand, they can look rather drab and forgettable in shops, but in the right setting they are highly appealing with lovely subtle colouring. Once established, they are hardy and tough, but getting them to that stage can be so frustrating. All in all though, this just makes them a very interesting fish to have a go at keeping. Anywho though, I hope you've enjoyed this little video all about Norman's Lampeye Killifish. Happy fish keeping everyone, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye!